Welcome to the latest episode of Gryphon Manor. Now, in the last episode, I set up the proper storage networks throughout the estate, and now there's a place for everything, and everything has a place. And that was an important milestone in this project, but today's episode is about another major milestone, one that is every bit as important, but much more complex. And it's not just the design that's complex, so is the story of how I came up with it, and so it probably requires a little bit of an explanation. But before I go into all that, let me set the stage by talking about one of the quirks of my personality. Now, you may have heard the old idiom to hope for the best but prepare for the worst. Well, that's pretty much me, and you can change the adjectives to reflect almost any situation. Hope for easy but prepare for difficult. Hope for fast, but prepare for slow. Hope for a natural disaster, but get up and go to work anyway. I think you get the general idea. And that means that I have a long history of over-engineering and preparing. In other words, if I needed to be able to smelt 4 things at once, I would set up a rig that ran 8 or more furnaces. I've been this way as long as I can remember, so it might just be in my bones, or maybe it's from years of experience. However, it's definitely the experience that has led me to not only build a lot of extra capacity, but to try and design and build it in such a way that it should be easy to add even more capacity should the need arise. And on a separate but related note, I prefer solutions that are, quote-unquote, fire and forget. For example, if I have to choose between one big machine that has a very high output but requires constant attention and resources, versus a bunch of smaller machines that output less, but I could set them up and let them run without any intervention or additional resources, guess which option I would choose? So that's where this story starts. When I was first learning about the Create mod, I saw right away that there are essentially free power sources like water wheels and windmills, and that there were others, like steam engines, that required extra stuff. Now, the vast majority of my contraptions that need power are deep underground, so that logically rules out windmills, but water wheels are a fire and forget solution as long as the water keeps flowing, and that's pretty much a given in Minecraft. So my original vision was for a huge bank of water wheels that would be hidden within or near the base, and I would have all the permanent, no maintenance rotational power I would ever need. Now, I tried to implement this in the Gryphon Hall series, and that was about as successful as a lead balloon. I'm sure it would have worked in terms of the Create mod, but it didn't work in terms of my poor old PC. Now, I found that the performance problem pretty much went away if I ran without shaders, but for me, running without shaders is like eating spaghetti noodles without any sauce or oil. I mean, after all, why the hell would anybody do that? So if I can't run with my shaders, then I won't even bother at all. So I figured out how I could minimize the number of water wheels needed and then isolate them from each other enough to prevent the big performance hits, and that was the plan with which I started this project. Now, I would build the water wheels, and probably at some point down the line I would be using automated farms and machines to produce blocks of dried kelp, and with all that free fuel I could automatically feed my steam engines without having to manually tend to them all the time. So time passed, and while I was working my way toward the point where I would be ready to start building my power infrastructure on the estate, I was also doing a lot of video watching on the side, and one of the things I had learned was that I could in fact power a steam engine with no further inputs except water. It's called passive heat, and yeah, the power produced is kind of small, but it is slightly higher than my reduced water wheel design, and there are literally fewer moving parts or surfaces, so it's a shade more performance friendly. So this had me thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could and should skip the water wheel phase of the build completely. And then when I went walkabout a few episodes back, I also started prospecting for resources close to home, and I found a coal resource actually on the estate. Now that resource comes courtesy of the Create or Excavation mod, so I spun up my creative test world and I played with the mod a little bit to see how those work. And now I have a new plan. The new plan calls for a grand total of 8 steam engines, 4 primary and 4 secondary, and I'll place them in the unfinished places that I had reserved for the water wheels. Now, before I go any further with that, let me just step back for a second and address the steam engine nomenclature. In my world, and in the real world as well, an individual steam engine is a whole package deal. It includes the boiler tank, the heating system, and all the little mechanisms and doohickeys that convey the power from the steam in the boiler to whatever it is that the steam engine's actually supposed to be moving. However, in the create mod context, boilers and steam engines are entirely different things. In fact, the heat source and the boiler are their own separate things, and the steam engine is the mechanized arm that attaches to the boiler and makes the motions that generates rotational power. And in fact, there can be, and usually are, more than one of these attached to any given boiler. So, in my world, a big boiler heated by 9 blaze burners with a dozen pistons rotating off of it is a single steam engine. In the create mod context, it is a big boiler heated by 9 blaze burners with a dozen steam engines rotating off of it. Now, this drives me nuts. So for the purpose of this video and all my future videos that may or may not contain create mod steam engines, I will stick to my context. And if you're a hardcore create mod purist and using my context frustrates you, you just might consider switching to decaf. Anyway, the secondary engines use passive heat, and in this case, magma blocks. So once I kickstart them using hand crank, they will run in my preferred fire and forget mode unless and until somebody comes along and starts removing pieces. Now, normally, I'm the only one that could do that, but just to cover all my bases, I will state, for the sake of full transparency, that there may be a very, very, very tiny but non-zero chance that there is some random vandalizing jerk or mob out there, other than me, that might be running around in my world and could possibly goober up my steam engines. But I seem to have digressed a bit. The purpose of the secondary engines is to supply water to themselves and a minimal amount of water to the primary engines to ensure that all of the engines stay running, and also to power a mechanical arm that will feed the fires of the primary engines. Because if I left the primaries to also run in passive mode, the primary engines would be pretty much the same as the secondary engines, and that doesn't really do too much for me if I want to run anything more powerful or useful than a cuckoo clock. In turn, the primary engines will power a second and much higher capacity water input dedicated to themselves, and when fully stoked by the mechanical arms, all 4 primary engines will produce a little over 500,000 units of rotational force. But unfortunately, that will require a constant stream of fuel. Now, to achieve that, I will run the storage network out to each set of engines where solid fuels will be deposited on a depot from which the mechanical arm will pick them up and directly feed the blaze burners, just like a parent feeds a toddler, but with less mess and much less frustration. Now, this too will work in the preferred fire and forget fashion as long as there's sufficient fuel available. So the trick to making all of this work is to also have an automated fire and forget solution for generating fuel as fast or faster than I'm using it up. As I said before, I was planning to use dried kelp blocks, but with an unlimited supply of coal already on the premises, the new plan is to tap into that instead, and then to optimize it to the point where it will supply all 4 engines with enough fuel for constant operation, as well as a slight surplus that will accumulate in storage for whatever other needs might arise. And of course, all that extra coal will go into coal storage until it's needed. Of course, there is a caveat to all of that. While steam engines do indeed require fuel to be more effective, they also require water, a non-trivial amount of water. And this brings up another interesting case of context concerning the create mod. And after considering this for a bit, I decided to modify the level design of the workshop and storage levels to compensate. It all boils down to what the create mod allows me to do versus what the authors of the mod really intend for me to do. Put another way, steam engines require water, and since water was introduced into the game, a player can create an infinite amount of water in vanilla Minecraft. Now there's the vanilla way, and now there's a completely separate context for infinite water as per the create mod. To review, infinite water in the vanilla context works like this. Use a bucket to place down a vanilla water source block, and then use another bucket to put down another vanilla source block in one of the 4 cardinal directions with an empty block between the two. What you'll find is that the block in the middle will transform into a source block of water as well, leaving 3 source blocks where there were originally 2. However, if you scoop up the middle block with one of your now empty buckets, the 2 other source blocks will regenerate the source block you just scooped up, and in this way you can grab as much water as you can possibly ever use. Easy peasy. And this can be directly used in the Create mod. Place a copper pipe at the surface of the middle source block of water that keeps regenerating, and run the pipe back to your steam engine, and be sure to have a mechanical pump in the line and pointing away from the source of water. Power the pump and you're basically doing exactly what I described before. Your pipe is sucking up the source block, which gets regenerated, which in turn is sucked up, and the cycle repeats. And in this fashion you can feed your steam engine with just a small amount of vanilla infinite water, even when you speed up the pump. Obviously, the Create mod clearly allows this, and it has pretty much always allowed that, so that's the way it's supposed to work, yeah? I don't think so. Now, why in the hell would I say that? That's because the Create mod also gives us the hose pulley block. Now, it's a block that, when properly powered, will lower a hose into a body of water, and will then literally drain that body of water, unless that body of water is large enough to be considered an infinite body of water as defined by the Create mod. Now, in this case, currently the Create mod defines an infinite water source to be 10,000 or more adjacent source blocks of water, so a fair-sized lake or ocean would work, but a pond wouldn't. Now, both of these water sources will work to supply water to a steam engine. However, why would the Create mod authors add the hose pulley and all of that extra baggage unless that is the officially intended source of water, and using the vanilla context infinite water block option is just a temporary workaround to facilitate gameplay until they're ready to fully switch to the more restrictive source? After all, once upon a time, you could fire up a furnace and use the heat to spin an encased fan and thus generate rotational force. And they removed that once the other power sources were more fully developed. So I suspect that something similar is going on here. So with all of that said, I could take the quick and easy way out of this and use the vanilla version of infinite water, but I'm going to stick with what I feel is the official and proper way to handle it. So I will build underground cisterns near each of the steam engines, and they will be big. After all, they need to hold at least 10,000 cubic meters of water, but they will do the job. They probably look kind of cool while doing it, and will almost certainly remain valid if or when the Create mod team decides to pull the plug on the simple vanilla workaround. Another design element I want to talk about here is power distribution. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I have a conduit layer under the floor of each level, and that's where I've already set up the transport network to support the storage system. Now, my original plan was to use the same layer for running power, but then I would have had a problem where the power system needed to intersect with the storage system, thus cutting off both. So my intended solution was to run the storage through the floor of the workshop and run the power through the ceiling, which is also under the floor of the level above the workshop. However, since the boilers for my primary steam engines are so tall, I could add the pistons so that they will run directly under the neighboring catwalks, and then I could run all the power distribution under the catwalk network, which is already extended throughout the level. I think it will give the level more of a working or operational feel, and frankly, it will be a hell of a lot easier to access it for modifications or repairs, and that will happen pretty much every single time I add a new machine or processing station. It will also make it easier for me when I need to add power to immersive engineering devices. And that's because when transferring immersive engineering power via immersive engineering wires, there's some power lost over distance, which is how it works in real life as well. However, there is no power loss over distance with the Create mod, so I will use the Create mod to distribute the power, and at each immersive engineering station I will set up a speed controller and alternators so that I can convert the rotational units of Create into the forge energy units used by immersive engineering. Yeah. I know what you're thinking. On the one hand, I will create cisterns instead of using the vanilla version of infinite water, but on the other, I'll use create to work around the designer intended power loss from the immersive engineering mod. Yeah, it's hypocritical. It's my ball and my court, so I play by my rules. Like I said before, switch to decaf. And finally, there's the little coal mine and its processing station. Now, the immediate goal is to get it going and running hard enough to fully fuel the engines, but after I get that sorted out, I'll work on the cosmetics to give it a believable look and feel for a supposed coal mine or production site. The first step is to build a prototype secondary engine. Now, the secondary engine works with passive heat, and it's not intended to provide much power beyond running a couple of mechanical pumps and a mechanical arm. Since it runs on only passive heat, I can use any one of a number of passive heat sources, and in this case I'm laying down magma blocks. As the name would imply, steam engines need and use water to generate steam. In fact, they use a lot of water. And as I stated earlier, I will use cisterns to supply the water, and I'll pull it out of there through the use of hose pulleys. Now, I'll be using 2 hose pulleys. The central one will provide all the needed water to the secondary engine and enough water to the primary engine to keep it alive. The second hose pulley on the right will be dedicated to the primary steam engine, and when it's fueled and running hot, that pump will be screaming like a banshee to supply an immense amount of water to the primary steam engine. Now I place the actual steam engine block on the boiler for the secondary steam engine, and in this case I mounted the steam engine block a bit further back on the boiler to give me room for some speed shifting using cogs. There's nothing magical going on here. I'm using the old manual method of increasing RPMs by having small cogs running off larger ones. For now, I will leave them in the open like this, but once everything's up and running, I will go back and case them at least enough to keep the cogs from floating in the air. But I might go all the way and encase the whole shebang. After all, I made a bunch of brass casings just in case. The next step is to connect the ramped up cogs and set them to drive a mechanical pump that will pull water from the hose pulley and to also drive the hose pulley itself. And with the passive heat running and the infrastructure in place to pump water, all I need to do to kickstart this baby is to manually spin the hand crank, and that should transform the secondary steam engine into a perpetual motion machine. And there you go. The secondary engine is now completely self-sufficient, and now it's time to build the primary engine and the supporting bits that will be powered by the engine I just completed. The primary engines will be big, and while I could run them with passive heat, that's not going to get us very far. So they need to be active, very active. And to set up the support structures effectively, it will be necessary to lay out where the engine itself will be and then place the supporting bits accordingly. Now, since this is going to use active heat, I will need live blaze burners, and since I need 9 per primary engine, and I'll have 4 primary engines, I will need a total of 36 active blaze burners. So I guess I need to spend some time in the nether. In previous episodes, I found a nether fortress and set up a relatively safe method of entry, and I've been able to go in there and bag random blazes as needed, and up to now, that met all of my needs. And I could probably stick to that model, but this is going to take an unreasonably long time for 36 blaze burners. So, luckily, I stumbled upon a proper blaze spawner, and while I did not mark the location on the map, I'm fairly certain I get back there again, and I'll mark it on the map when I go back. But the bottom line is that I now have enough active blaze burners to proceed. I've run the infrastructure for the storage system all the way back to the engines. Now, I've set up secondary storage controllers with brass funnels, and the brass funnels allow me to drop a full stack of items onto the depot in a single go, and I can also set a filter, which is critical as it would otherwise drop the contents of the drawer closest to the primary controller. And as it turns out, that means my mechanical arm would be trying to fuel my steam engines with stone blocks. Amusing? Yes. Useful? Not particularly. So I had to use a filter, and at the moment the filter is set to just plain old coal bits. Later on I will add dried kelp blocks. And when the current stack on the depot is used up, a new stack will be deposited on the depot, and as long as I'm producing more coal than I'm burning, this should be the bit that sets up the whole power system to work in my preferred fire and forget mode. Of course, the fuel's not going to just jump into the blaze burners by itself. These mechanical arms will sit between the primary and secondary steam engines, and they are programmed to take whatever's on the nearby depot and distribute that material among the 9 blaze burners. This is a critical piece of the puzzle unless I want to spend all my time babysitting the engines. This placement of the arm is also very practical in that it's next to the output of the secondary steam engine, so it's a very simple matter to power the arm. And at this point, the secondary engine is almost fully equipped. The primary boiler is going to be much more capable, and that means it has to be scaled up. Literally. Unfortunately, a larger boiler will also be much thirstier than the boiler used in the secondary engine. To get it started, I'll need to bring a little water, but this will be pumped by the secondary engine. And with the secondary engine running in passive mode, it may not produce much power, but it'll run forever without intervention. And this means that the primary engine will never completely die either. Even if it runs out of fuel, it'll fall back to passive mode, but it's still receiving enough water from the secondary engine, which means all I would have to do to bring the primary engine back to full power would be to give it fuel. However, for the primary engine to run at full power, it will need a lot more water. Much more water than the secondary engine can provide. And this is exactly why I have a second hose pulley installed, because by adding a steam engine block and connecting it to a speed controller, I can crank the RPMs to 96, and now the primary engine is sucking in an incredible amount of water through its dedicated hose assembly. And at this point, the primary engine is producing a ton of potential energy. I just need to tap into it. Just a note about create steam engine blocks. Each steam engine block in the create context is able to create a maximum of a little more than 16,000 stress units, which means that even though the current boiler setup will support production of 131,000 stress units, I'll need to add at least 12 create steam engines to the boiler to actually unlock all that potential energy. And yes, that is indeed documented in the wiki, but I was too absorbed to jump out of the game and look it up, so it took some time for me to figure out why my monster boiler was barely able to power one ore extractor. But it's water under the bridge at this point. And the steam engine blocks have been added. Now there are 11 installed at the top and at the same level as the power distribution network. Now you may remember that the 12th was installed at the base to pump water, so that block is not part of the main power network. Now when I look at the completed primary engine from this angle, it looks kinda sorta like a large copper robotic Cthulhu. I'm sure the effect is even greater when viewed from the ground. For now, the engines are running on my energy reserves. And while I was out pushing back the borders of the known world, I tended to pick up most of the coal I ran across, and so it should come as no surprise that I've accumulated a stockpile of just under 10,000 coal, and that should keep the engines running until I can get the ore extractors up and running. Now, based on my experimentation, a single ore extractor equipped with a diamond drill bit should be able to dig up enough coal to support real-time operations for 1.5 of my primary engines. Therefore, if I set up and operate 3 such units, that will support 4.5 primary engines, and since I only have 4, that will give me a little surplus that will accumulate and thus be available for any future projects or plans. It was in trying to use these ore extractors that I learned that there seems to be no apparent limit to how many that can be run against a single vein. The only limitation seems to be that the extractors need to be in the chunk that contains the vein. And therefore I've taken the liberty to stack my extractors vertically, which made it easier to provide power to all 3 and to set up the connection to the storage network. Basically, as coal falls from any of the 3 units, it goes straight down to an open chute that immediately inserts it into the storage network, and it's then available for use in the primary steam engines. And now that all 4 primary engines are up and running at full capacity, I have the power distribution network generating over 450,000 stress units, which hopefully should last a while. Yeah, my original design was for another 70,000 or so, but those final 4 steam engine blocks are working off the grid to power the dedicated water sources for the primary engines. So I'm perfectly satisfied with what we have here, at least for now. And I think that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to complete in this episode. I had decided to take the long and winding road and build cisterns to feed my steam engines, and I did that, all 4 of them. And I needed to build the secondary and primary steam engines as well as all the attendant bits that keep them going, and that's done. And I needed to set up a power distribution network to essentially wire the entire level for power, and that's in place. And finally, I needed to tap into the infinite coal resource on the estate so that I can keep the steam engines fired up and running with no further effort on my part, and I did just that. It was a non-trivial bit of work, but between this episode and the last one, I now have the industrial infrastructure to start putting in processing stations and automation, and I will soon get to the point where the resources I'm growing on the surface will move underground, leaving the surface estate free and clear for the purpose for which it was originally intended, that is, the building the manor that this series is named after. But that will need to wait a tad longer, as the next episode in the series will not take place on the estate, but rather I will return to Andover to build a local inn, which will house the entire current population of the village, and in future episodes I will extend and expand the village and its capabilities. So I'm looking forward to that work almost as much as I do the work on the estate. But in the meanwhile, I hope this finds you and yours in good health, good spirits, and a touch of good fortune. Take care of yourselves out there. Cheers.